Welcome to UK Fashion in Japan in conversation with Jonathan Anderson. Today, we're here thanks to the generous support from the UK Department for International Trade and in collaboration with Bunka Gakuin's International Institute for Fashion in Industry and Academia. Today, we will be discussing what Britishness in fashion really is and the similarities and differences of the UK and Japan fashion industries. We are joined by two very special guests, Mr. Jonathan Anderson, the creative director of JW Anderson Loewe, who's joining us from Paris, and Ms. Saori Masuda, the fashion director of Vogue Japan and our MC for today. She'll be leading our discussion. And also 5 Bunka fashion college students from different courses throughout Bunka's educational program, who will bring their opinions and unique perspectives as the future leaders of Japanese and global fashion. My name is Jordan Kaneshige from CPR Tokyo, one of the organizers of today's event. I'm also a Bunka graduate myself, and I will be your co-host. So without further ado, I'd like to have our special guests introduce themselves. I'm sure most of our audience has heard of you, Jonathan, but would you mind giving us a short self-introduction for those who may be hearing you speak for the very first time?
I'm Jonathan Anderson. I am the creative director of my own brand, which is JW Anderson, which I started many years ago. And I am the creative director of Loewe, which is a Spanish luxury brand, which is based in Paris and is owned by LVMH.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And Saori, may I ask you to do the same?
Yes. My name is Saori Masuda. I work for Japanese Vogue as a fashion director. So shall we start?
Yes, I leave it to you.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about the British fashion. What do you think about British fashion? What is British fashion for you? Tsubasa?
Okay. Hi, I'm Tsubasa from Intensive Garment Creation course. For me, my image of British fashion is really connected to music culture, especially rock, because a few styles are inspired from bands from UK. For example, the mode style are inspired from the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and the other punk rock style are inspired by Sex Pistols. What about you, Azusa?
Hello, I'm Azusa. I'm major in Creative Design Advanced Diploma course. Personally, I really have the image of tailoring, highly skilled tailors, Savile Row, like the unique heritage of England or UK. So it really connected to the attitude, I think, like British people, in my mind, they are cool, they're laid back, they have the confidence. So that is my image of British fashion.
Right.
Yeah, me too.
What about you, Jonathan?
What is my viewpoint on British fashion?
Yes.
I'm originally Irish, from a very small island in Britain. My viewpoint always has been on the idea of British style is that it is very kind of associated to a youth cultural movement. So where you have people that are very famous designers that have come out of Britain have usually been kind of influenced by subcultures and youth culture that has happened within history. So if you take, for example, punk, and you end up with people like Vivienne Westwood, which then in turn then inspires a next generation like John Galliano. And then at the same time, then you have the historical anxiety that comes from, say, someone like Alexander McQueen. So I think for me, Britain is about this idea of, the idea of music, the idea of a cultural movement, but ultimately it is rooted in this idea of new subcultures that come out of it. Is always been my kind of viewpoint on style. Even when you look at Savile Row tailoring and how it evolved over the years, if you look at the 70s, you had tailors like Mr. Fish, who was, more of an extreme version of tailoring in that period, which was connected to music of that period.
So you also are very much influenced by the youth culture of England.
Yeah. The way in which when I started my brand, when I was a lot younger and I was at university, I was very obsessed by this idea of gender and how gender was playing into, when I would go out clubbing, what did it mean? Like why people wore certain things and what younger people were dealing, or my generation were dealing with in terms of gender. And it wasn't in a weird way about unisex. It wasn't really about androgyny. It was more about personal choice. It was what, it was a kind of need to dress in a certain way. And I think when I look back on that period, which is now nearly 15 years ago, I think a lot of that came out of this idea of like where fashion historically had looked at kind of gender in terms of a kind of like definitive boxes. So if you look at Jean-Paul Gaultier, it was kind of a representation look of fetish or representation look of queer culture in a kind of more literal sense. It was more kind of decorative. And I was kind of, when I started, I was really into this idea of like, what is the kind of psychological effect of a man wearing a shirt and a woman wearing a shirt, or any gender wearing a shirt? What did that mean, And I think there was something definitely in that moment where, we're in a moment of rap and, we're in a moment of TikTok. We're in a moment of, self-expression to all limits. Whereas in that period, it was very about indie music. It was like the Baby Shambles. It was a very different period. And I think what it was about was kind of self-expression through this idea of being comfortable of oneself, ultimately.
Right. Nagisa-san, I know you're interested in the...
Yeah, because you mentioned it. Since you mentioned it already, hi, I'm Nagisa. So since you said it's rather about your personal choice in fashion, rather than just like unisex clothing, is that the reason why you focus on gender fluidity in your collection a lot, so they can have their personal choices when they pick up the clothing, or then when they choose their own styles when they dress up? Mm-hmm.
My whole philosophy has been that you can never tell the customer what to do. The minute you tell a customer what to do, then you end up cornering the person into a certain dynamic. So I kind of, and plus it gets really boring for me, because then I end up making a look and then someone wears the exact look. What is nice is that you make something and then you let go of it into a creative world, and then people do what they want with it. Everyone's a different body shape. Everyone has a different kind of aesthetic. So it makes these garments, which ultimately go down a runway in one vision, become hundreds of different versions of what it could be, And that's where I think you end up finding new ideas, actually, because ultimately you see the clothing is worn in different ways, or you might see a different person wearing it that inspires you to the next collection.
Like more experimental, you would say?
Yeah, no, I've always been about extreme. I believe there has to be a purpose for doing a fashion show. I think there has to be a purpose to design something. I don't believe everything has to be commercial, because if we make everything commercial, then we don't get experimentation. But I understand the logistics that you have to run a business. I work for a very large company, and responsibility to make sure that a business grows. So I think it's about a precise balancing act of finding newness, but at the same time not alienating the consumer.
Right.
Thank you so much.
So I know that the craftsmanship is a very important element on your creation. Does the UK, especially craftsmanship, affect your design?
Yes and no at the same time. My relationship with craft actually comes not from fashion. It comes from ceramics. It comes from textile. It comes from basket making. It comes from very kind of primitive things, which in a weird way, I have more synergy with Japanese culture in terms of craft than I would say with British culture. And I say this in a being someone who is British and being someone who loves Japanese culture. What I love about when I look at Britain, we historically had a lot of craft. We had some of the most amazing mills that were making suiting fabric. We had amazing denim making. We had a lot of amazing knitwear, basket making, all these different things. And over the last 100 years, since the, or more than 100 years since the Industrial Revolution, Britain has contracted in craft, there has been a kind of resurgence in making, but some of the most amazing things that we did have no longer exist. Which, we do as much as we physically can in Britain that we can find. So we do a lot of hand knit, whatever mills are left, we use. We use small factories and things like that. But when I look, for example, at Japanese culture, there is a protection in craft as much as there is modernity. I remember one time when I joined Loewe, I always wanted to go to Hamada's house, who is a very famous ceramicist, or a family of different ceramicists. And in the very beginning of the 20th century, Bernard Leach, the British ceramicist, goes to Japan to meet Hamada, and they collaborate together and they learn from each other, a British man and a Japanese man. And what is interesting is that when I went to go and see the son and the father, there is a kind of thing in Japan where you protect craft. It is seen as, people are national treasures. In Britain, we don't have national treasures. In Japan, there is, we have like CBs and OBEs and things like that we give out to people who do amazing things. But this idea that the ceramicist can be just as important in society as the athlete is very interesting. It's like a generational protection thing. When you look at tea ceremony, or you look at the tea bowl, for example, which is a very simple vessel, you have families that have been making them for more than 14 generations. And I think this is something where Japan is one of the leaders in the world in terms of protection of craft, because it is about the next generation. And I think sometimes Britain can learn from that, because I think it's about how do you protect these things. But Japan is very good at it. It's one of the most amazing, when I go to Japan, when I haven't been in since the pandemic, I always come back with bags of stuff, because I meet so many amazing craftspeople who are making tablecloths, or making ceramic, or making woodwork, or lacquer work, or even when I go to kind of like, even I've been to like markets where young designers are like redoing denim, and I'm kind of like mesmerized, because there is such this like precision in the make. And I think fashion is about the make. It is about the craft. It is about how you conceive an idea. So Japan is very lucky at that, which is in a weird way kind of it's kind of contradictory in terms, say, for example, in Japan, in terms of architecture, where I think when you look at Tokyo, for example, they will rip a building down and they will build a new building. There's very little old buildings left in Tokyo. So there is a reinvention thing. And in a weird way, craft is reinvented but protected. So technology is involved to make things more interesting, but Japan is willing to look after the past ultimately. So yeah.
I find that really interesting because a couple of years ago, I did an interview with Makiko Minagawa from Issey Miyake. She's the textile designer there, and she said something very similar, that the idea of tradition becomes tradition because there is evolution and transformation there that leads to new ideas and allows it to last that long. And I think that connects to the idea of the evolution with the buildings. There has to be that evolution. I think that's something that Japan really takes to heart when it comes to building that tradition. But I know that Azusa had some questions about the tradition as well, and like how that connects to your design.
Yeah, so you really put the idea of craft in your design. Is that something you were influenced by the British culture or even Japanese craftsmanship? Or is that something like included in your brand's concept? Because I saw your very first collection of J.W. Anderson was like, I saw some really black, dark, regular fit clothes, whereas now you do some bright colors, like the image of ceramics, the ideas of craft. So did it evolve with the time?
Yeah, I think the joy of being a designer is that you get old in it and your eye becomes different. In the beginning, the way in which craft was used in the beginning is I was very obsessed by Aran knitwear, which was made where I grew up in Ireland. And I did a lot of things which were very simplistically, but very complex in terms of craft. And then as I started doing more menswear, I kind of became obsessed about this idea of the silhouette, this idea of the black silhouette, the idea of a pair of ruffled shorts with knee-high boots and a bustier. It became about ultimately using a singular material to create something. I think it wasn't really until I joined Loewe and I was trying to work out how to take a nearly 200-year-old brand, reinvent it, but at the same time, talk to a younger demographic. And I've always been kind of obsessed by the idea of making things. I think I could watch videos of making things all day, no matter if it was a car or someone making a ceramic bowl or someone baking a cake. I like this idea of the process. And I really thought, like, how do I make the process sexy to a younger generation? Like, how do I make young people be like, actually, it's really exciting to knit a jumper or to cut things out to make something or have the kind of desire to use their hands. And I think that's what my whole thing is with craft. Why I put it into my work is ultimately, as designers or creative people or as humans, we love the idea of using our hands to make things, and it is something that no matter, like a lot of people will say to me, well, I'm not a creative person. But ultimately, when you use your hands, you become creative, you are able to do different things. So my whole thing is that, like, even in your own home, you are creative with your hands, because what you do is you move objects around the room to make you feel better, or to not make you feel better. Or some people have very tiny bedrooms. Some people don't have very tiny bedrooms. But in the end, we have to make a bed, which for me is a creative act, you know? And I think that's why it's so important in my clothing, because I think it's the human part. I think craft is the human part of in a commercial world, ultimately.
Right. Mark?
Yeah. I'm Mark. I'm a first year garment creation student here at Bunka. And I think British fashion specifically, and then more generally, any creative process is this sort of conversation between the old and the new, and the history and the new innovation. And so what I wanted to ask you is how you, when you sit down to design something, or when you sit down to plan out a vision for a creative work, what your process is with sort of tying together this old historical tradition of doing things, and then sort of these new innovations. Because if you rely too much on the historical elements, you can get stagnant, right? And if you innovate, too crazy, there's also this, you have to count on the fact that people will be interested in what you're doing, and that it will relate to the customer. So yeah, I wonder what your process is like when sort of sitting down to weigh those two elements of creative work.
I think the way in which I kind of deal with the past and the present, or the future, is, I think it's like a kind of weird balancing act, I always think that ultimately we live in a world that has got different things that are out of our control that fundamentally make creativity happen. So, and those things can be repetitive in every 100 years, So even if we look at, say, for example, the 20s, I, over the last 2 years, have found the 20s very interesting, because I think it relates very much so to where we are today. So there, you kind of delve backwards to kind of learn what they learned in that part, and how does new materials or things advance that. And that's more kind of like, the kind of roaring 20s, this idea of loose clothing, the birth of jersey, the birth of silk, and the flapper, and beading, and minimalism, ultimately came from a pandemic, which, was where clothing was a lot heavier, a lot more wool oriented. And the reason why clothing became looser is ultimately because of hygiene. It wasn't really to do with like designers being like, we're going to do this. It was through a necessary need. So I think there is moments where, fashion has this amazing ability to relapse on itself and reinvent itself at the same time. And I kind of love doing it. Like, I kind of love, like, in a collection, to have something incredible. You take an historical reference, and then you kind of destroy it at the same time. You kind of morph it into something. I did a collection before the pandemic, or maybe 2 collections before the pandemic, where I was kind of obsessed by dresses that kind of went outwards, and there was different moments of this. You had Poiret, who had kind of visited this in the 20s. In the 1700s, you had it in France, where it became incredibly wide. And I like this idea that you would show the construction. So it became like sexualized. So it became about seeing the knee-high boot through the dress. So it became about more of a voyeur onto this. But I think what I find not kind of digress and kind of, I'm not very good at answering questions in a very straight line. What I find really interesting about the idea of past and how do you marry it to the future, what I think is really weird and interesting about this period is that we live in a new kind of generation. I never experienced this when I was designing fashion. When I first started, this was like before, this is when I had a blog, and then suddenly we had like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, like, I mean, there's so many platforms all around the world that we suddenly, as a kind of creative society or people who wanted to engage in fashion, which ultimately there is always going to be a past in fashion. We, the next generation became obsessed about the idea of ownership in fashion, this idea who owns what. But when I started fashion, it wasn't about that. You had greats like John Galliano and Alexander McQueen who were able to take all these different references and represent them. And we're fine to look at referencing. You know, we're fine to kind of look to Poiret or look to Worth or, you know, or be influenced by Japan, you know? And now we end up in a very weird part of like how we deal with the past and the present, is that we are in a kind of weird sort of society moment where we are more excited about who owns what and how do we destroy that, because we want to kind of show that we know more, you know? And this is why I find this period, in terms of the idea of looking to the past and looking to the future, one of the most exciting moments, because we live in a kind of weird, secular kind of paradox, because ultimately we want the industry to change. We want the industry to become better. We want the industry to look to the future of technology, environment, design, gender, inequality. But at the same time, we kind of want to keep it trapped within its own thing. So in a weird way, when I look at what I do, when I'm meeting these two kind of like hot and cold like water, I'm always trying to look at a way that you are proposing a question to the audience of why we make clothing. I always feel like everything I do, there has to be a why. Why we put two things together. Because that's where excitement comes from, I think.
Right. Do you have any further questions or?
Talking about why, your latest collection, women's wear, why did you use like the tire shop or the tire as an like part of the look?
Why did I use the tire as the background?
Yes.
I think I was obsessed about this idea of we're in a moment of outrage on things. There is gender outrage, there is inequality outrage, there is we are scared of so many things. And I wanted to kind of look at the idea of the pin-up calendar that you would have in a garage of a naked woman, which in today's society is kind of now, rightly so, should not be viewed in that way. And I wanted to kind of flip it so that the girl in the image becomes empowered, and the location of where the calendar would have sat in a men's environment, in a men's garage, while fixing cars, the girl is in the environment where the calendar would sit. So it was kind of about a reference of really kind of saying, well, you know, where we sit in society does not matter. It is how we own it and how we make sure our message is heard. So it was really not about the collection per se, but it was more about the idea of the pin-up today. If that answers that question.
All right, thank you. It's clear now.
Okay, so I would like to talk about sustainability.
Yeah.
Which is a big topic in Japan, of course, worldwide, I guess. What is your idea of sustainability in the UK fashion industry?
What is my on the UK? I think it's not really. I can't really speak in regards to the UK. I think ultimately it's a global thing. My viewpoint on sustainability is incredibly clear. I see myself as a realist. Like, I like things that are real. I don't like things that are fake. I believe that in every industry, fashion is right up there with the car industry, the oil industry, the telecommunications industry, the food industry. My viewpoint on sustainability is, if we are going to do something, it has to be rational and it has to have a timeline. We are, as a society, unraveling the Industrial Revolution. It will not happen overnight. So if you're going to do something, you have to do it with full transparency and it has to be real. It cannot be a PR marketing technique. It has to be done on all levels of the business, from travel to how much water is used in leather, how much water is used in denim, where can we improve as an industry together. It cannot happen one company at a time. It has to be led by governments with rules. Because if we don't do it, there will be no one to sell to. Like, this is the reality of sustainability. It cannot be something which is used as a selling technique. This is my biggest belief. I think it is a fundamental. But I believe that it cannot happen overnight. I don't think, as the saying is, Rome was not built in a day. We are fundamentally going to have to reconstruct the entire industry from the ground up. So it is better to do that all together than working against each other, and we have to be realistic as well, because we have to balance many different things within this, I think, for example, we have to think of employment is one massive thing that is happening in the world that the clothing industry is involved in. It is a huge employer. No matter if it's stores or it's the factory or it's the design studio or it's the mill or the button factory, all these things are huge employers. So I think as an industry, the idea of the responsibility to the environment itself is paramount in design, because that is what the world needs. It is like when the world tells you something, the modernity is in that. We just have to unravel a system that has been built over the last 100 years. And it is this unraveling. If we work collectively together, then we can get somewhere. If we don't work collectively together, we get nowhere. And I think this is, inside both brands, we do everything that we physically capably can do within it. We're not perfect. I kind of feel like a lot of people pretend that they're perfect, but they're not, do you know what I mean? And so my whole thing is, with sustainability, it is about being a realist who is constructive. You have to be constructive in this, and it is, I think this is where I think we will get further in fashion if we all kind of work together on it, because it's I need the raw material and I need the factory to be able to produce the raw material to be able to use. I need to make sure that there is a cost implication, because I think a lot of people's answer to it is ultimately there has to be we don't want clothing to be an alienating thing, which is about saying, well, you can't afford it, because that really is not the point either. So I think, as every single industry, I think fashion is very easy to kind of point the finger at very quickly, because we are about glamour, we're about celebrity, we are about excess, we're about glossy images. And I feel like it's easy to kind of like pigeonhole non-success, instead of kind of saying we should celebrate every single positive thing that's happening, and then say, but we have still got 99% to go, but we will do this together. And then I feel that we get somewhere exciting. I feel like, the minute it kind of, I remember when I was younger, I remember being really scared of the idea of acid rain. When I was a kid, there was like TV shows which were all about acid rain. And I used to be like, I was like, oh, where am I going to, like, I remember Leonardo DiCaprio was like the head of this campaign, and it disappeared. It was like I never heard about it after that. We are now in a humanitarian crisis, So we have to, but at the same time, I want to be able to be creative and do my thing and be an individual, but at the same time, I need the environment to be able to work in. So in a weird way, if we collectively kind of go towards something, then my whole thing is, if we're able to go to space, we are able to sort this problem out. It's crazy. So, but it takes society to move forward, and sustainability has got many different factors involved. I think as a designer, I'm not going to say that I know everything. I don't. I think we do as much as we physically can, and when we do it to the best that we can. Can we do more? Hell yeah. Can everyone do more? Yes, of course. But I think there needs to be more government action. I think there needs to be more kind of leadership within society, that we need to be able to improve technology to be able to get there. We need to be able to work out how to deal with taking waste and making it into interesting things. Do you mean? Because ultimately, the other factor in this is, population has grown at a crazy rate. I always do this thing where I type in when I was born, and I look at the population, and I type in today's date of what the population is, and it is quite baffling. It makes me feel like I was born in the 1800s or something, because it's sort of, the jump in population is giant. So all these factors come into where we need to go. And I don't want to whitewash things. I hate saying that we, in fashion, I hate when people say, well, we are carbon neutral, but it's impossible to be right now. You can offload it, but that problem pops up somewhere else, So I think the fashion industry, like all industries, are probably 1% along the line of the 100% that we need to go. But it is society, it is everyone, because ultimately this is, is happening in the oil industry. It is happening when you turn the light on. It is happening when we waste food, or when we do all these different things. So I think I would love to sit here and say I have this solution. I have the dream and I have the ambition to work towards that. But are we 100% there? I cannot sit there and say, yes, we are, because we're not, because I think that would be being dishonest. And I think, but I know that in society we will do it. It's going to take time. And I hope we have enough time is the biggest question.
Oh, right. I guess Yuki has a question.
Like you talked about this earlier, but like for a single piece of garment to be made, it can take a tremendous amount of time, craftsmanship, effort, and skill. But this cost very often does not translate well to consumers' sense of value to purchase clothes. So, like, how can we as an industry tackle this miscommunication that has been around for the longest time? Like, do you have any idea to approach to the consumers or the world?
Well, this maybe kind of then goes back to a bit about sustainability as well. My whole thing is when I get up in the morning, I always, when I watch the news or I flick through Instagram or I look at Netflix or I watch a film, I always think to myself, if we looked at clothing where we actually realize it's made by people and it does not grow on a tree, I find sometimes when I look at the price of a t-shirt, I think that maybe society feels that the t-shirt just comes out of this like tube that just like, makes it. It just blows out of it. So they just grow on trees somehow, that they just magically appear. I think if we understood the supply chain and the make of something, we would then understand the value of it. And we would then look after this product. Do you know what I mean? And we would understand why it costs this much. And then that's why we would only buy so many of them. Do you know what I mean? Because we would have the value of it, Yeah. I think the idea of a t-shirt in today's society costing less than $2 is impossible. Like it is just technically impossible, because someone has to make it and be a very skilled person to put in the shoulder line, to do the side seam, to attach the rib around the neck. This is a skill. And I think the end consumer needs to realize that skill is not something which is a lesser skill than someone who works at Apple. Like this skill has been done for hundreds of years, and therefore, if we want things to be made beautifully, we have to protect this. And there is things that can be exemplary versions of things. We have couture still today. They are exemplary versions. They take thousands of hours, and that is why they cost this amount of money. There has always been in society people who can afford it and people who cannot afford it. This is the history of the world. This is not a new concept. But I think sometimes if we kind of reinforce this idea that fabric, it's like it's so interesting. I find sometimes it really interesting that like people don't realize that buttons can be made from shells and they are handmade and they take time, and it does cost money because ultimately you want to pay the person what it's worth. So, I think sometimes we are able, weirdly, in fashion to kind of say, well, why should something be this price? But we don't question that in the art world. We don't say, well, why is the painting 1.5 million? Why is it that? And I feel like sometimes we and I can be just as bad. Sometimes I just value the idea of fashion compared to art. But ultimately, the idea of the clothing itself is a kind of an amazing thing. It is something that we have been doing for centuries that is which you can tell the period you're in, it is a very important piece of information. So I think if we give more value to the make and more value to the idea of this garment that we should look after and try to wash better and look after it, then we would have it for longer, you know? And then we might get our value out of it, you know? It's like a car. When you buy a car and you drive it off the car lot, it loses its value. Like that, you know? And I think we sometimes have approached this same thing with clothing because we're just like, well, there's more of it. We will just get rid of it. Instead of saying, well, I want to keep that. Like, you know, when I get a sweater, I'm going to wear it until there is no sweater left. You know, if it gets holes, then it's great. It's even better. You know, and, you know, I think these are things that, you know, I think the next generation, younger people, are starting to do. I think they're starting to kind of realize that there is like, you know, there is value in something that is made by people. And if you can't get it new, you can still buy it old, you know, or you can still buy vintage and it's still just as exciting, you know. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's sort of around there.
Thank you. Like in my opinion, once like economics is involved, people stop worrying about who the jobs are outsourced to, and that makes kind of amorphous manufacturing process and made or making tragic problems like Rana Plaza. So, but we can aware that and learn from our mistakes. Yeah.
Yeah. The great thing about society is that, like, if you remove religion from it, and we were to take like one concept from this idea of like how society was built, we should be able to learn from our mistakes, but to not be judged on them. You know, we should be able to improve or allowed to improve, and we should encourage society to make mistakes and to improve, instead of kind of destroying and never forgiving. You know, this is the thing. I think we don't get progress without it. You know what I mean? I'm not a religious person at all. So, but this idea of, you know, forgiveness is very important, I think, within everything in society. And this is not to do with just fashion. I think we should be able to encourage to do better in the factory floor, to do better in sustainability, to do better to the person you say hi to. You know, these are things I think when I look at younger people, this is what's happening. People are starting to realize that if we do not kind of look forward in a positive way and do not help each other along, we end up getting into a very kind of negative environment, and negativity gets us nowhere. Like,
Thank you. Would you like to ask questions?
Yeah. So Jonathan, do you feel there are opportunities for Japanese fashion students to work or start a brand or company in London? And what skills do you think are the most important for that?
so just say the first part of you cut out at the beginning. What was the first part of your question?
Okay. Do you feel there are opportunities for Japanese fashion students to work or start a brand in London?
Of course.
So, and what skills do you think are the most important for that?
I think you need to have patience. I think I'm not very good with patience, but I have learned patience as I do my job. I believe you can start a business anywhere in the world, ultimately, as long as you believe in what you're doing and that you know that it's not going to happen overnight. I think you need the patience to be able to, as we were saying earlier, to make mistakes and get better. You know, I think what I like, why I opened a business in Britain was, what I like about London for me is it's like this melting pot. It's like, you know, it's this like kind of like bypassing of different people from all different parts of the world, you know. And, you know, I moved to East London. So that was before it became very trendy. And you could start a business as a stand at a market, you know, and grow from there. You know, I feel like it's got this sort of kind of like do it yourself kind of approach in fashion. You know, I think, for example, Vivienne Westwood is probably one of the greatest examples of someone who started from nothing and built something, you know. So I think there is this I think there is an openness in Britain. Britain is going through a very complex Brexit moment and all these different things, but the people in it, the creative people that come to Britain from all around the world, I think fuel what fashion and making business can be. You know, like we still have Savile Row tailors still going, because I think has always been this obsession about starting businesses that are involving clothing. I don't know what it is. And it doesn't matter how big they are. Sometimes in France, everything's very big. The brands are huge. But I quite love in Britain that you have small brands, and you know, you have brands that only make knitwear, and you've got brands that only make ties, or you got somebody makes amazing jewelry. And it's sort of like, I think there is an openness that you can create there. If you know what I mean, there's a kind of creative feeling towards business, you know.
Thank you so much.
So thank you, Jonathan. So based on what we talked today about Britishness and craftsmanship and sustainability, where do you think your design philosophy is going in the future?
I don't know.
Sorry.
In the future.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think since the last women's wear show the very first show after the pandemic was Loewe. I did it, you know. I feel quite recharged, weirdly, in terms of design. I feel quite excited about design. Where is it going? No idea.
Mean, have you changed yet? Does your philosophy, do you think it's gonna, I'm sure it's gonna change, but like in what way, based on you Irish, but you know, combined with all the characteristic you have, and also this pandemic?
I think I'm at a point in life. I think what the pandemic did to me was I actually enjoyed the pandemic at the beginning. Because I've been, you know, running around flat out for 8 years. I think I was doing something like 10 international flights, like long haul flights a year, and traveling every week back and forth from London and Paris. And it was actually quite nice to actually have 3 months of not going anywhere and actually sitting and being bored, like being like missing people and missing the idea of being in the studio and being grateful of what I had. Do you know what I mean? I think sometimes we move through life and we forget what we actually have around us. And I actually felt better, weirdly. I felt like I got up in the morning and I didn't feel like I had a headache. I got up in the morning and I, you know, was able to go for a walk and do things and think to myself of like, why do I do fashion and what do I want from it? So I think it helped me to focus. I think what I'm doing in both brands is I don't care anymore about the industry and pleasing the industry anymore. I'm more excited about what turns me on all the time. Like, I'm only going to make stuff that I care about. I don't care if journalist B likes it. If the buyers don't like it, then that's their problem. I just want to make clothing that excites me. You know, it's sort of like, for me, it was like, I like this idea of like, that fashion can make some sort of weird realities. I like this idea of, a heel that was going through an egg. I wanted dresses that kind of looked like you were being kind of like there was like someone put a broomstick through your body and it was like poking out. I wanted things that were like non-realities, you know? And so I think in a weird way, I'm excited for the next part because I think there's so many amazing young people that are doing really interesting things, and I have to keep them. I have to keep up. You know, I have to. You know, as much as I am the creative director of 2 brands and things, I have to still be relevant. You know, I think sometimes younger people think, oh, wouldn't it be great to? It must be so easy, and you know, when you have all these like things around you and you can do everything. But I have exactly the same anxiety every morning, which is, am I still relevant? Can I still speak to a different generation? You know, can I, like, my sister is younger than me. Can I still entice her with what I do? And I think in a weird way, that's what I'm excited about, is being able to forget who I am and be able to kind of like be curious about other things. I think the biggest advice that I could ever give to anyone creative who wants to work in any creative field is that if you are not curious, then stop. Like, you have to be curious. Curious about different cultures, curious about different people, curious about, and there's so many things that happen in a day that I'm like, how did that happen? Like, how did they, you know? And I think it is through curiosity that we find interesting things about ourselves. It might be a TV series you watch and you're kind of like, I'm so curious that someone actually made that something that bad, you know, or you know, there's all different things you will see, you know. And I think the minute that you do not have curiosity, then it's very difficult to create, you know.
Wow, amazing. So we just look forward onto your next collection.
Yeah, let's see.
Yeah.
It might
Thank
be
you so much. Sorry?
It might be a disaster. We never know.
No, we never do disasters. Thank you so much.